The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation. JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of others at the JFK Library Foundation or the JFK Library, including staff, board, or donors.
People are eager to think about what is the role of public history and how history is relevant to when we think about a democracy.
45 presidents have taken the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. As America celebrates its 250th anniversary, what can the lives, leadership, and legacies of those presidents and the first ladies who stood beside them teach us about sustaining our democracy? Today, former U.S. Archivist Colleen Shogan joins us to discuss In Pursuit, a new essay featuring reflections from former presidents, first ladies, historians, journalists, and other leading voices. Together, we'll explore how the project hopes to help preserve and strengthen our democracy for the next 250 years. That's next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to our special America 250 celebratory season of JFK 35. As the United States marks its 250th anniversary, we'll explore the ideas, values, and debates that have shaped our nation. Throughout the season, we'll be joined by historians, journalists, and other leading voices to examine the past, better understand the present, and consider the future of American democracy. Joining the podcast for our opening episode is Dr. Colleen Shogan, the 11th Archivist of the United States and now CEO of In Pursuit, a project to collect essays about American history. Colleen, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
This is your second visit on our podcast. I'm excited to have you back. The first thing is, can you tell me a little bit about the project In Pursuit and what is the goal of it?
Well, thanks for that question. In Pursuit is a history-based civics project that's national in scope. And what we've done is try to figure out a way that we can identify the most relevant and accessible lessons from the past 250 years of American history and see how we can disseminate them to as many Americans as possible. And the way in which we've done that, that's a pretty tall order. So the way we've gone about it is asking a number of prominent former elected officials, Pulitzer Prize winning historians, prominent journalists, other thought leaders to write short essays, only 1,200 words, about our presidents and select first ladies, and asking them to identify one lesson that we can learn from each person's leadership in the past.
This sounds like an amazing opportunity. How did you manage to pull this off and get people like former presidents and first ladies to join the project?
Well, In Pursuit is a project of More Perfect, which is an organization that brings together 43 presidential centers and foundations and sites from across the country and other civic organizations. So More Perfect has a pretty broad reach, and we had contacts with all the former presidents. Obviously, I served as Archivist of the United States and was involved in all of the presidential libraries of these former presidents. So when we reached out to their teams and we reached out to the former presidents and first ladies, to tell you the truth, I'll be very honest with you, it wasn't a hard sell to get them to participate. They were very eager to participate because they wanted to do something relevant and involving history for America's 250th anniversary. And they wanted to make sure that it was done in a way that was not partisan or political in any way. And that's what we guaranteed for In Pursuit.
It's a fantastic idea, and it's great to see it play out. Why do you think now is the right time to have these reflections, other than that it's the 250th anniversary of the country's independence? For example, why do you think it's important to have these leaders, journalists, and other public figures talk about democracy at this time?
I think that a lot of people, I mean, obviously, we're having a national conversation about public history and how we think about American history. That is, as you said, I mean, that's obviously been infused by the fact that we are in 2026, the 250th anniversary of the United States. But, there's also been certain actions that have happened in the recent past about public history and concerning the Smithsonian Institution and other organizations. And so people are eager to think about what is the role of public history and how history is relevant to when we think about a democracy. And I think one of the most important things we can think about is we have to use our past. As I'm a political scientist, I'm not a historian, so I think of things in terms of information and data. And we have to use our past as, really relevant information and data about what has worked, what hasn't worked, where we could improve in certain instances. And so we need to be able to look backwards in order to look forwards. And, my experience serving as Archivist of the United States is that Americans want to do that and they want to engage in this type of historical inquiry. They're curious about it, they're excited to learn about it. And my guess was that if we went out with a project like In Pursuit, there would be a lot of Americans that would be interested and follow along. And we were right.
What are some of the reflections in Pursuit that you think are important for the public to read?
We started out with a terrific essay about George Washington written by President Bush. And I think what a great lesson that President Bush surfaced right in the get-go, which was the importance of humility in leadership. And I think this is a lesson that all Americans can take to heart. It's not just for politicians, absolutely not just for our elected national officials. That is a lesson that's relevant to people who work in any number of professions. It's relevant to people's situations and families. It's relevant to people who are volunteering in civic organizations, the role that humility plays in our own lives, sometimes admitting when, that we don't have all the answers and how important that is for leaders in a democracy. So we started out with a very, very strong essay, and then we've continued from there. I mean, other essays, Danielle Allen wrote a terrific essay about John Adams and surfaced a lesson that I didn't really know that much about John Adams, that one of the most impressive things about John Adams as a leader was that he knew who to pick around him. Good leaders recognize talent that can surround them and make them stronger. And so she provided several examples of how John Adams did this. Lindsay Travinsky on John Quincy Adams, that sometimes the decisions that a president makes in a certain situation aren't immediately relevant at that time, but then have long-term ramifications for the future. We certainly see that with John Quincy Adams and his view of foreign policy. And John Meacham on Andrew Jackson wrote a very, I think, even-handed view of Andrew Jackson, a very controversial president in American history, but an essay that showed where Jackson's relevance in defending the Constitution was very important, but then other aspects of his leadership were things that we would say were certainly things that we need to learn from, and perhaps mistakes that we wouldn't want to replicate. So I think, we've had a really great start, and we're only 7 weeks into the project. So we have a lot more of information and essays to come in the future.
For In Pursuit, are you only writing essays on presidents, or are you tackling other figures as well?
Just presidents and select first ladies in this iteration of In Pursuit. But, we think that In Pursuit is a project and a model that can be replicated over and over and over again with different historical figures. And so we're very excited to move into 2027, where we will portray historical figures other than presidents and first ladies.
That's amazing. And obviously, so much of this material, I'm sure, as you know, comes from the archives. Archives like here at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum and elsewhere. What do you think, as we approach America 250, what the country can learn from materials found in these archives that we have all across the country on notable figures or events, things that are usually chronicled? We have such a rich diversity of archives in this country, which is one of the things I feel we're lucky to have.
When I speak across the country or when I do podcasts like this, I encourage all Americans to engage with whether it's local archives in your community to learn about the history of where you live or where you grew up, to learn about your own family's history, or to learn about your own community's history. But also to engage, as you mentioned, at the national level. I was on the JFK Library's online archives recently in this past week and was using some of your search engines and presentation. It is just fabulous. It's really well organized. There's so much that has been digitized from the John F. Kennedy collection. I am someone, as a political scientist, who is really interested in speech writing and rhetoric. And I was able to go immediately, within 1 or 2 minutes, I was able to find all of JFK's speech files on the JFK Library website. It was so easy. And before I knew it, I was looking at, edits that Kennedy had made on important speeches and his own handwriting. And if you are someone who likes history and wants to engage with history, it used to be that you had to go and travel, for example, to the Kennedy Library in Boston to be able to experience and see these documents. But now that we have been able to digitize a lot of the most important documents, presidential history and other aspects of the federal government, you can actually do a lot from your computer at home without ever having to travel or leave, which is great because that promotes access. We don't want to just restrict access to people that have the wherewithal to be able to travel, that have research funds and things like that. You could actually do a lot of research on the Kennedy administration, I think, just from your own computer.
This reminds me of a discussion in my own community. Our town was recently debating whether to spend money preserving historical records like town warrants from the 1800s, and someone asked, why does this matter? The answer was that we don't always know what future generations will find valuable, but those records tell us what happened to people at the time. And that leads to my broader question. Why is it important to preserve history even when we can't predict what future historians will learn from it? And what responsibility do historians and archivists have in preserving that record for future generations?
You make an excellent point. We don't know exactly what will be important 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now. A great example of that when I was archivist that I learned about was that from Navy ships, there were preserved records of deck logs where people on Navy ships would preserve the water temperature for many, many years in our nation's history. They would take, when they were out at sea, they would take measurements of water temperature. Well, it turns out, those are really valuable records now that you have water temperatures from over 100 years ago, as people are starting to, study the ocean and the impacts potentially of climate changes, of how different currents are changing. You read about this sometimes in the popular press. To have access to those deck logs and being able to make those comparisons, they would have never known 100 years ago that was going to be important to us in 2026, important to scientists, but it turns out that it was. The same thing with your town. There might have been warrants made, like as you said, as many as 200 years ago. But you're probably living under those same warrants, unless they've been repealed or they've been changed. So if there was ever a motion to examine those or figure out maybe you do want to amend them or change them, you would want to have the legislative history to go back and understand why they were enacted in the first place so that you can have an argument for why they would want to be changed or repealed. So it's actually very important to have that history at your hands because you don't know exactly what questions in the future will be posed that you will need access to that information in the past.
That story of the deckhands really highlights why preservation is so important. Looking more broadly at history, how do we elevate the stories of women, people of color, and other marginalized communities whose experience may not have been documented as thoroughly as those of presidents and other prominent figures that you're looking at? How do historians find and tell those stories?
Yes, that's a terrific question. And even as we are portraying, obviously, presidents and first ladies having not a particularly diverse group of people in American history in as a whole, save obviously President Obama and Mrs. Obama, we are also prioritizing stories about those presidents that do impact other populations, such as Native American populations, of course, women, African Americans. So we can tell those stories even through our presidents and our first ladies. But in general, I mean, this can be a challenge. And you brought up, the role of archives. And sometimes this can be a challenge because, as we know in the past, there were decisions made about what records we're going to keep and what records and manuscripts and letters and all those types of things, and what things we are not going to keep. And we know that, up until a certain period of time, certainly, anytime before the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, before the Civil War, we missed an awful lot of records. There's a paucity of African American history in this country, in large part because the history of enslaved people was not captured in the archives, not captured in these records. And that affects all kinds of African American families today. They struggle with trying to tell stories of their own genealogy because the limitation of records and information that is available. So there is, a challenge there, that we want to tell those stories, but sometimes the information and the records are not anywhere near as available or as prolific as the records for other people in the United States. So there is that challenge. But that doesn't mean that in other places, if you can't get creative to be able to tell those stories. Certainly with women, with first ladies, we're finding that a lot of presidential administrations, the stories were told oftentimes by male historians that focused on the political administration of these White Houses, but didn't focus on, for example, the role that a first lady played as an advisor to a president. And when now historians are going back and really doing the hard work to trace back to figure out, well, what was the role, for example, of a Sarah Polk influencing James Polk? That essay is upcoming, In Pursuit. We're finding an entire treasure trove of evidence saying that she had a great, huge, outsized impact on the decisions that her husband made, affecting the outcomes and affecting democracies in ways that we never really imagined previously. But you sometimes need to get creative to track down the letters and track down the information, because it's not always readily stored in the places that we're able to look.
There's always been this debate about how you teach American history. One side says we need to focus on the positive and emphasize all the positive good that's come from this country. And then on the opposite end, people say there are a lot of dark parts of our history that we need to reckon with. And so how do we, from your expertise as the United States archivist and a political scientist, how do we recognize the place of uncomfortable histories and their roles in the formation of our country?
We have to include those stories in our understanding of American history, because if we only celebrated the successes or successful leadership in our presidents or in our other political leaders or even our cultural leaders, if we only did that, it would be a very strange story to tell, because how would we celebrate the success if we didn't understand all the attempts to succeed before them that failed? So we have to include the failures and understand where there might have been attempts to move forward, to expand the scope of what we consider to be we the people, but those attempts were thwarted. So we have to understand when we tried to move forward and were unsuccessful. So then when there are successes, we can appreciate them and understand that full retelling of history. So I always, when I was the archivist, and I still stand by this, I absolutely say that uncomfortable histories or difficult histories are part of telling accurate history about the United States. We have to tell an accurate representation so that we can understand. If we just forget those particular stories, then we're not doing a very good job in representing what actually transpired in our nation's past. There are plenty of successes that we can talk about, and I'm not someone that says we should shy away from talking about those successes, but we do have to have an accurate representation of the full story.
Our show always likes to anchor President Kennedy in every interview, so here's our President Kennedy connection to your work. President Kennedy spent much of his administration promoting democracy at a time when competing visions of self-government were available, particularly for the United States and Soviet Union, who were promoting their ideals to developing nations. How do you think JFK's focus on the importance of democracy then connects with your work promoting democracy through In Pursuit today?
Wow, that's a terrific question. I mean, I think one thing that we're trying to do with In Pursuit is to tell these stories of the past to inspire the next generation, to inspire them about stories about public service, stories about how you can make a difference in a democracy. And I think probably President Kennedy is known the best for his ability and his leadership in a very short time in office, that he was able to inspire an entire generation of people who came into not just politics, that came into public service, into volunteerism, because of President Kennedy's focus on asking people to join him in service for democracy. So that's one of our big goals for In Pursuit. It's certainly one of the goals of More Perfect. We have 5 democracy goals at More Perfect. In Pursuit is in civic education, but we have a whole other democracy goal about the importance of volunteerism in civic life, in civil society, which I think is very consistent with what President Kennedy did. We need another inspirational moment like that moment that President Kennedy gave us to inspire the next generation of government service, public service, civil service at all levels of a democracy. And I think that's what hopefully we're looking for in 2026.
For my last question, what do you think will be required of our public servants and our citizens to ensure America lasts another 250 years?
I will say this: democracies are not self-sustaining. I said this many, many times as the Archivist of the United States, and I continue to say it. They're not self-sustaining and they're not self-executing. We may have self-evident truths in the Declaration of Independence, universal self-evident truths in the pure Enlightenment sense of the word. But that does not mean that just because they're self-evident, that they will always be there, that governments will always be there to make sure that we enjoy those freedoms and those liberties that are discussed in the Declaration of Independence. A democracy depends upon its citizens to engage and to learn about the world around them, and that is your local community, of course, your state and where you reside as a state. And then in the United States, the national perspective, and of course, the United States' role in the world writ large. And part of that is understanding how the government works, so civics, and understanding a shared common understanding of our history. We can disagree on different interpretations of history, that's fine, but I'm talking about a basic understanding of our history and what has transpired to get us to the point that we're at today. So I really put this back on citizens. There's a lot of hard work that has to go into being a citizen in a large democratic republic. And people need to take that seriously as they become, after their education in high school and learn about American democracy. Take what you've learned in high school and hopefully middle school, and then apply it to your life when you enter community life and civic life, and take it seriously. Learning doesn't stop when you're 18, 19, or 20 years old. You have to continue to pay attention in a democracy. That was something my parents, who were not political people, but they never missed an election. And my mother always said, as a citizen of democracy, I need to know what's going on in the community so I can intelligently cast my vote when I go to the polls. And I think that's a great lesson that we have to remind people about.
Thank you, Colleen, so much for your work on In Pursuit. The essays are fascinating and great lessons for all of us as we approach the country's 250th birthday. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to our first episode in our special America 250 Summer Series. If you're interested in learning more about some of the items discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. It includes links to photographs and all of the items we mentioned today. If you have any questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at jfklibrary using the hashtag JFK35. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.